Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I actually am a chartered surveyor by trade and a land agent, but started doing renewables about 25 years ago, and you can see things have come a long way since then. So I've been chairman of Scottish Renewables for 7 of the 12 years of its existence, so do a lot with policy. I was asked to come along this afternoon, hopefully to update you on what's going on behind the scenes, because what goes on behind the scenes at Westminster and in Europe, rather than just at Holyrood, does frame out what we can and can't do and sets the future framework for future development in the renewable sector. So my slides are mainly bullet points. There's a lot of quite technical stuff on it. I don't expect you to follow all of that, but hopefully they will lead you to different websites and you'll be able to look it up yourself if you wish, or by all means, please contact me and I can go through things with you to clarify things if you wish. I think to start at a very high level, we start with something that's only just been passed a couple of weeks ago. And of course, energy policy as such, as Westminster will be quick to tell you, is not devolved to the Scottish Parliament, although planning is. And energy policy in the UK has to comply with certain overriding rules at Europe. Now, the European state aids rules were published just over a week ago, which will guide how the framework for renewable energy support will be laid forward from 2014 to 2020. It comes into force on the 1st of July. It does apply to all member states, and it sets up a framework for all renewable energy support. And that framework is set on a series of principles for which will be the theme going forward for renewable energy in Europe, as long as you are a member state, I say in a reserved fashion. So what the themes are, I think it's best to pick up on the themes. You can read the different points down there. But the themes are that Europe are looking to take away the subsidy from all power generation. So that's coal, nuclear, oil, whatever, gas. Strip all of that out so that everybody's competing in an electricity wholesale market, which likewise is a single European wholesale market. And this may seem a mile away, but actually in March, 28 countries synchronized their wholesale markets on a day ahead to practice for this happening. So it isn't that far ahead. Politics will delay it, but in practical terms, it won't be a blink in terms of infrastructure investment before we get there. So the principle there, single wholesale market, single electricity price or wholesale market for electricity based upon nobody having any subsidy, and then a carbon incentive laid over the top of that. Now this won't happen until 2025, 2030 period, but nevertheless, it's the direction of travel, and this EU state aids sets up technologies to move in that direction. Okay? Now, the important thing about it is, things like for feed-in tariffs, they would not be allowed under the state aids rules, for example, unless it was for very small projects or for projects that were seen as non-mature technologies. For example, hydro would be seen as a mature technology and would have to go into an auction system under and compete with other technologies in that auction system under this state aid scheme. So it is a scheme which is taking the current support systems, trying to harmonise them by 2020 within countries, and those systems are to be based on competitive auctioning for mature technologies and allocation stroke feed-in tariffs for smaller and less mature technologies such as wave and tidal, for example. So I think that's, if you take that theme away with you, you've got a general gist of the direction of movement within Europe. What does it actually mean within the UK? What I'll go on to talk about is electricity market reform. Now, electricity market reform is a fundamental reform of our electricity market and our system for renewable support. It's designed to unlock £110 billion worth of investment for 10 years. for a 10-year period. It's something which has to pass this new state aid set of rules. DEC are confident that it will do so, but won't actually be able to guarantee that until October, which is why miraculously no auctions will be held under this system until after October. So, because until then they can't back up their words with actions, because otherwise they'd be like the French. The French had their system challenged 3 years ago. It's taken 3 years for them to change their feed-in tariff to comply with the then state aid rules. They did it just in time to avoid these ones, otherwise it wouldn't have complied with these either. So, we've got a system where all legacy contracts are secure, so the change is only for projects going forward, so projects that have not been developed by the end of the last regime that went out. And our current regime, obviously, is renewable obligation and feed-in tariff. Feed-in tariffs and renewable obligation will remain secure until the end of their duration, which is renewable obligation 2017 and for feed-in tariffs 2021. Now, there's one reservation to that, which is the point at the bottom here. And that is, if you ask for something which the European Union deem as a material change to your feed-in tariff, then within 12 months of them deeming it to be a material change, you have to comply with the new state aids rules. So you throw out the feed-in tariff and bring in competitive auctions within a 12-month period. So what we have to do as an industry with feed-in tariff is to work very closely with DEC and to make sure that any changes we do from time to time to the feed-in tariff are seen as non-material changes, so they don't trigger this change to the way in which the system would work, which would be a rather fundamental review of it. So I think that probably outlines, as I said, I won't talk to my slides completely because that's so boring, it's unbelievable. So what is electricity market reform about? I shall try to engender some enthusiasm here because it's a really boring subject, to be honest, but it's something we do have to try and live with. It's to create a clean energy market. So it's to bring back nuclear, it's to encourage renewables, it's to bring on a bit more gas, and it's to take out coal. So it's really to decarbonise our electricity market going forward. It's also to bring competition into that, to move things like onshore wind to the actual market price. Take out, again, so that you can see the themes here matching the European Union state aid stuff. It works on the basis that the renewable obligation government perceived as being not necessarily all of the cash flow was deemed as being bankable or secure. And as a result, what they've looked at is creating a new system which they believe should give you greater security for your revenue, and in return for that, you give them a lower price. So it's the old adage, high risk, high return, low risk, low return. I'm not entirely sure they've lived up to the low risk bit, but they've certainly gone for the low return. Well, the jury's still out on some of this. The other thing is, you've seen that a flavour of the month is the Competition Commission in relation to the Big Six and the wholesale market, etc., etc. It's quite clear there is not enough liquidity in the wholesale market in the UK at the moment, which gives very little transparency to people to understand it and to forecast it and to trade in it if you're not one of the oligopoly Big Six. So what we're looking at here is a process which makes it obligatory to have 25% of that electricity traded. At the moment, that is only 5% that's auctioned. The rest of it is all done with deals behind the scenes between the Big Six and big suppliers, etc., etc. So what we're looking for is a more liquid wholesale market and more transparency in that market as a result of price, which is good for us in the longer term, but creates a little bit of uncertainty in the period of change, as everything does. It's introducing more aggregation and suppliers, so more competition, encouraging nuclear, etc., etc. I won't go through that completely. Electricity market reform, again, what is the primary legislation? It is the energy bill. All of these things have primary legislation and then secondary legislation which implements it. So primary legislation gives the Secretary of State his generic powers to do something. Secondary legislation implements that into law. Secondary legislation does not have to go through the same rigmarole as primary legislation, so therefore you can tweak the system and manage the system as you go through with secondary legislation, but the rules are set out in the primary statute. So that's already in place. That achieved royal assent in December last year. Secondary legislation, that will be finished and done and dusted, certainly by around July, August this year. And that has set up a levy control framework, which is essentially, to all intents and purposes, our budget for the next, essentially, which takes us through to 2020 for the support of renewable projects. That includes FIT, it includes the final investment decision enabling contracts, and it includes the renewable obligations. So everything that we're probably dealing with within this room. It makes assumptions on the wholesale market price which aren't necessarily entirely safe. So it doesn't necessarily fill us with glee and security, as I pointed out earlier. For example, the assumed wholesale price was assessed by the greater and the good in DEC and all of the treasury boffins when it was assumed there would be a carbon escalator within the overall wholesale market. The Chancellor, because of all of the hoo-ha about electricity prices, removed that escalator in his last budget, which is great for business, reduces the wholesale price, but it now means the levy control framework will have to support there'll be a greater level of support to support the same amount of generation than compared with the assumptions made in the original budget. So things change as life goes on, but the Treasury ain't changing the budget. Some things will be positive, some will be negative, but that was not moving in the right direction. It'll make about somewhere in the region of a £5 billion difference over the next 10 years in what will go to support renewables. So not necessarily the most welcome of announcements from an industry point of view. Contract for difference. That is the main vehicle of delivery under the electricity market reform. It's a 15-year power purchase agreement, and you must pre-qualify before you can go into it. That gives you a list of things which basically show you roughly how it works. There are two types of contract. One is a year-ahead contract, which is designed for baseload plant, and the other is a day-ahead intermittent plant contract for wind and hydro and things like that. So you can read all of those and work those out for yourself. Now, that is probably an interesting schedule that you can look at a little bit later, because what it does is it compares what the current RO gives you compared with the contract for difference. So it gives the fundamental differences there. One's 15 years, one is 20 years. Your RPI instead of CPI, RPI is slightly more beneficial in the long term, all the modelers seem to think. No cap on price within the RO because you get a fixed subsidy, but the wholesale market, as it increases, you keep all of that. Within a contract for difference, what happens is you have a strike price, and as the wholesale market increases, it comes to meet that strike price, so the subsidy reduces and the wholesale price takes over. And in fact, if the wholesale price exceeds the strike price, you have to pay back. So it's designed to pay back the consumer over the life of the 15-year contract, depending on which technology it is. So it's quite a different set of systems here. The other thing that's quite important to note is that these systems are very, very different in that the RO is plug and play. So you build your project, you plug it in, and when you've produced a megawatt hour, Ofgem register it, and away you go with a 20-year contract. With contract for difference, you have to bid up front, you secure a contract before you enter into any form of construction of the project, and if you do, in fact, it precludes you from getting a contract from difference. So what you've got here is a situation where we're going to be going, which is quite difficult for DEC to calculate, where we go from a renewable obligation, which is a plug and play, to a system that has a 2-year lead before you deliver new capacity, which means we're still building RO projects at the same time as we're bidding for contract for different projects, and the two overlap each other. So getting the budgets and the balancing of those budgets right is quite difficult for DEC. And their past history doesn't mean to say they're going to do a very good job of it, it has to be said. But anyway, we'll see as time goes on. I don't want to be too skeptical. Right, that's roughly how a contract for difference works. Unfortunately, I did this at about midnight. I downloaded the wrong graphs. It's got years along the bottom. They should be months. But essentially, what you're looking at is a spiky, the black is the spiky sort of electricity demand, and assume that's just through a 24-hour period or whatever. So the blue is the wholesale price of the market that is assumed the day ahead by their great modelling as such. The green is the subsidy bit, and the strike price is what you bid into your contract for difference, and that's the price you get awarded in your contract for difference for the 15-year period. You can see that if you go above there's the spike halfway along there, and if you go above the price with the wholesale market, above the strike price with the wholesale market, you pay back that little red blob at the bottom. Now, actually, that seems like a pretty fair system and quite insignificant. In financing terms, that's quite difficult because generators have always only ever been receivers of money before, and in financing terms, you're now talking about a reconciliation which actually could make you have to pay stuff back, and that actually in financing terms isn't just as simple as it sounds. Right, this gives you the list of prices, and it also shows you what the budget is scheduled, this levy control framework that I talked about. Those are the gross budget figures year on year for support up to 2020. So shows you there's quite a lot of money involved, and it shows you that it's nearly doubling in that from 2011 through. Again, to look at in your own leisure. Right, what are the likely impacts, essentially, of this process? When you compare a renewable obligation contract with a contract for difference, and onshore wind is probably the biggest area where this might apply, it's equivalent to about a £15 to £20 per megawatt hour difference as an NPV at the front end of your project. So guess what? Everybody's going to be racing to get in by 2017 when the RO finishes. So they don't have to bid competitively into a contract for difference. There's a grace period on the end of the RO, which is 12 months, which means that you could, for certain reasons of grid and MOD restrictions, you could actually extend the period you've got to deliver your project to for 12 months, up to 12 months. But those are going to be relatively rare. I think offshore wind in Scotland is marginal due to its deeper water, because offshore wind as such in Scotland is in about 40 to 50 metres worth of water, whereas down in the south and on the east, it's in 20 to 30 metres worth of water. There will be a competition for allocation of contracts, and the most competitive projects will win. So Scottish Offshore, apart from the Beatrice project, which was announced this morning in the early award of contracts for difference that didn't have to go through the process, so that's an SSE project up in the Moray Firth. That project got awarded a contract. So 500 megawatts of offshore could come forward, assuming they can build to those contracts. But apart from that, you're unlikely to see very much offshore in Scotland. The Scottish Government loses, which is quite important because it's a very, very supportive, as you found from John Sweeney this morning, they lose their ability to play around with the renewable obligation, in other words, the support level. Under the renewable obligation, they were able to play around, and hydro still, by virtue of them, has one ROC as opposed to 0.7 of a ROC, which would have happened if it had been Westminster in charge. So several things, and Wave and Tidal have benefited from their intervention of 5 ROCs as opposed to 2 ROCs within England and Wales, and then they were forced to bring theirs up to levelise to 5 ROCs. So the Scottish Government has played a role there in making sure that Scottish projects can actually be delivered in a way they wish to see them develop, and a structure for an industry they wish to see develop. That's taken away under contract for difference. There is no power for the Scottish Government. Having said that, under a devolution max or whatever, there may well be some chance for that to change. Right, I think I'm over time. Am I over time? Yeah, well, I'd better stop, I suppose. I'll leave you all to this lovely schedule, and you can peruse it at your leisure. Any questions, come back to me. But roughly those, I think, will be the big, grand impacts of electricity market reform and state aids. Thank you very much.